Hey everybody, Mr. Richards here. I'm going to show you how to do your torque or speed car build. The first thing we're going to do is get our chassis set up. A chassis is like the frame of a car. Everything is put on the chassis, wheels, axles, motors, body, whatever. In this case, the chassis is going to be this black metal piece. It's in the second drawer from the bottom in cabinet number 2. Now the reason we're using a larger chassis this time is because we have to fit more things on this car. We have to fit a motor unit, we have to fit a Cortex, and we need to fit a battery. All of those things are barely going to fit on this chassis. So it's going to be important to make sure we have enough space. So use this black metal piece to start. We're going to use the same kind of components we've used many times before. In this case, we're planning for 2 axles and 4 wheels, so I've got 2 bushings for each axle. Unfortunately, the only axles that are going to work for us are these 12-inch long ones. Alright, so we get the axles through there and we'll add the wheels. Now, you have 2 options. You can build a car for speed or torque. The speed build is a little bit more straightforward and a little bit simpler, so I'll show you that one here, and then I'll talk about the torque build. For the speed build, your driver gear is going to be larger and your driven gear is going to be smaller. I'm holding a driven gear. This is a 12-tooth gear. Now, you can use whatever gear you want, and you might end up changing your gears. But remember, the motor unit is going to be your driver. The wheels are going to be driven. That's how cars work. So you want to make sure that your small gear, if you're doing a speed build, is on the axle that the wheel is attached to. Now, some students think that you need to include gears on each side of the axle. You don't. 1 gear is plenty in this case, so I've only included 1. And in fact, the more gears you add, the more friction there is, so the fewer gears you can use, the better, especially if you're going for speed. Now I can add my wheels on here. And of course, I'd need to put collars on as well to make sure the wheels don't slide off. Got wheels here in the back, and I'll put wheels and an axle in the front. Now from this point, you need to work on figuring out where your motor unit is going to be. I'll turn the car right side up, and you can see that my gear is right here. If you want to make things symmetrical, you could add a spacer over on this side or put an extra collar in there so that the wheels are sticking out the same amount, but honestly, it doesn't really matter. After this, what we need to do is figure out where our motor unit is going to go and what kind of size gear you're going to use on your motor unit. Here's the motor unit. Notice we have a motor inside a winch bracket with a gear on the outside. Now, the motor unit goes on top of the car and it needs to mesh with this driver gear, or the driven gear right here on the wheel. Okay, this is what you need to work on figuring out today. Where to put your motor in the motor unit, and which gear to use, and where it connects on your vehicle. Okay? So that's the job for the speed build. Remember, if you use axles that are slightly bent, or wheels that are a little deformed, or your chassis isn't straight, there's going to be more friction. And since most people will end up using the same gear ratio, the same motor, and the same batteries for your speed car build, it'll end up being that the car with the least amount of friction will end up going the fastest. So make sure you pick axles that are straight, a chassis that's straight, and wheels that are nice and straight so that it rolls with the least amount of friction possible. Alright, if we were going to do a torque build, however, we would want our driven gear to be larger than our driver. So we would try to flip it around. Here's the only problem. If we use this size gear for our driven gear, you'll notice that it's larger than our wheel. So that's not going to work. So how can we get a really high gear ratio, or a torque ratio, without using such a big gear? This is where a complex gear ratio comes in. Now a complex gear ratio, unlike what we've done in the past, it actually puts 2 gears on the same axle. Now, if you look at just this part right here, or I'm sorry, this part right here to begin with, you'll notice that I have a 12-tooth gear and a 60-tooth gear. This would just be a 5-to-1 ratio. 60 divided by 12 gives you 5. Okay, 5-to-1 ratio. And putting more idlers or more gears in the train wouldn't do anything. However, if we put 2 gears on the same axle, like I've done over here, you'll notice that I have a 60-tooth gear and a 12-tooth gear, on the same axle. Here's how this works. This 12-tooth gear, as the driver, meshes with this 60-tooth gear, and we get a 5-to-1 ratio. Then, this 60-tooth gear transmits its power on the same axle to this 12-tooth gear, which then meshes with another 60-tooth gear. So you end up with a 5-to-1, 5-to-1. When we have two gear ratios like that, we can end up multiplying them together. 5-to-1 times 5-to-1 gives you a 25-to-1 gear ratio. That's incredibly higher than just these two gears alone. The nice thing about these 60-tooth gears as well is that they are just slightly smaller than our wheels. So including just a simple not a simple complex gear ratio, but one complex gear ratio greatly increases your torque ratio for this build. Now, if you look at this, I've actually got a 5-to-1, 5-to-1, 5-to-1 ratio, which makes this a 5 times 5 times 5 ratio. 5 times 5 is 25, times 5 is actually going to be 125 to 1. What does that mean? It means that I have to spin this drive gear 125 times to get this driven gear to rotate once. It also means that the torque output is 125 times higher than just the motor alone. Pretty cool. Now, if you do build a torque ratio vehicle, there's one thing you have to remember. You can have all the torque in the world, but if the car doesn't move because the wheels are spinning, you've got a problem. How can we solve that? Well, if you look at a semi-truck, you'll notice that it has 10 wheels on it. 4 on each side in the back for a total of 8, then 2 wheels in the front for steering. Those 8 wheels in the back serve to give traction to the entire vehicle, especially when a trailer is loaded on. So adding more wheels and giving it 4-wheel drive is a really good idea if you want to increase traction for your torque build. Alright, I hope that's enough to get you started today. Good luck with your build, and of course, if you have any questions, please ask.